And today we're all going to be continuing our series on the unlikely characters of Christmas. But before we begin reading about the wise men who visited Jesus from the east, I have an odd question for you all. Raise your hand if you like it when somebody tells you what to do. Anybody? Or maybe if you like it when somebody orders your meal for you at the table without consulting you. Or even the small thing of picking the movie when you're sitting at home and they're just like, this is the movie we're watching, and they don't even ask for your opinion. Does anybody like that? No. We tend not to like that at all. We like to live a life where we have a say in the very basic decisions of our world all around us. We like to have our own autonomy, make our own decisions. It's the American way that I get a vote. And perhaps you've heard the phrase before, I'm the king of my castle. It means that while you may not have say in a lot of the domains in your world, once you get home from work, finally you get to be the boss. You get to call the shots. You get to decide what you eat. You get to grab that TV remote control and have power over what's on TV. That's the definition of being king of your castle. Wanting to be in charge and tell others what to do, it really starts quite young. I love our youngest niece. She's a firecracker, and my favorite thing, she's 3, is when she tells her older sister, I'm the boss. And what that means is I'm telling you how we're going to play dolls right now. She is very bossy and controlling, and it just cracks me up. She's so little, and at the same time, she understands how good it feels to be the powerful one who says, you get that doll, and you dress them in those clothes. She loves having that power and telling others what it's like when she's in charge. Maybe you've been disciplining a child and you've experienced this same thing in a different way. You try to tell them what to do, and they say, you can't tell me what to do. You're not the boss of me. And it's in that moment where we have to be like, well, clearly you're reading this situation incorrectly because I am the adult, and actually I am the boss of you. Now you're going to do what I'm telling you to do. This issue of authority here, it starts early, and for many people, it never leaves their system. They want to be the boss. They want to be in charge. They like to lead. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with leadership. Organizations need leadership. Families need leadership. But it's when leadership gets twisted and you get this warped sense of power and this demand for blind obedience. Just do it because I told you to do it. And if you were actually more than king of your castle, you could get away with that. Actual kings throughout history could just say jump, and their subjects would say, how high, boss? And that's how the world worked. But if you're the boss of a job and you have employees and you try to tell them what to do and they don't like how you're leading them, they just quit you. And they go and they get a new job and they get a new boss. And so as we come back to our story of Christmas and the story of Jesus, what makes these unlikely characters we're going to talk about is that there's more than one king in the story. And if you know, having too many cooks in the kitchen can be a bad thing. Having too many kings in a story is never going to end well. And so today we're actually going to look at this multitude of unlikely kings and the role that they play in the beginning of Jesus' life. And so in the many kings of the Christmas story, we first start out with King Caesar Augustus, the Roman emperor. He's in charge of the whole Roman world. And in Luke chapter 2, the very first phrase of chapter 2 begins with a very important piece of the story that he plays. Because God uses Caesar Augustus to make sure that Jesus is born in the right location. You see, when Mary and Joseph meet, and they end up being married, but not consummating that marriage yet, we see that they're living in Nazareth. And so while Luke 2 begins, those two are in Nazareth, but the decree by Caesar Augustus makes them get up and go to the hometown of Joseph, which was Bethlehem. So a very pregnant Mary has to sit on a donkey and travel for 90 miles south just so that they can fulfill the requirement of living in the Roman Empire right now and doing what this king has told them they have to do. And so, really, Caesar Augustus, while it's one throwaway line in the beginning, he made an edict that a census would be taken. He plays a really big role in this story. Next, we meet the magi, or as the King James Version calls them, wise men. That's why we sing about wise men in the story. But the Greek in the Bible that our Bibles are based off of, it's the word magi. And magi were non-Jewish religious astrologers who believed that the stars in the sky had significance, that God put those stars there, and so they had meaning. And so they probably came from Babylon or from Persia. They came from the east. And we can infer that they saw a star to their west, and they believed that that star signified that a new king of the Jews had been born. And so while the Greek called them magi, and they have this traditional title of wise men, they're actually often referred to as kings. And the reason that we assume that they were more than just some religious astrologers, but that they actually had some form of leadership over people, was because it would have been fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. So like Psalm 72 verse 10, talking about the Messiah who was to come, it said, "May the kings of Tarshish and of distant shores bring tribute to him. May the kings of Sheba and Seba present him gifts." And so it was believed that because these wise men, these magi, came and gave Jesus gifts, that they must have been kings and been fulfilling the prophecy of Psalm 72, verse 10. Then we got a third king on the scene, King Herod, also known as Herod the Great. And I want to give a little bit of explanation. When I read through the Bible, maybe you have as well, you see Herod show up over and over again in the story. And there's a bunch of different Herods, actually, and so it can be a little bit confusing. So the first Herod that shows up is Herod the Great. That's this guy from the Christmas story that we're going to read about in a moment. And he's remembered as being great because of his military and his building achievements. And then he had a son, Herod the Tetrarch. It's actually his youngest son. And Herod the Tetrarch shows up in Matthew chapter 14, and he's the one who has John the Baptist beheaded. Because John the Baptist says, "You're sleeping with your brother's ex-wife, you can't do that." And he kept confronting him on that, so he decided, off with John the Baptist's head. Then we have Herod Agrippa I, and this is Herod's great-grandson, so another generation down the family line. And he becomes king in Israel after the death of Jesus, and he shows up in Acts chapter 12. So when Peter gets arrested and he's sitting in jail, Peter's waiting in jail to meet in front of Herod Agrippa. But that night, the chains break off of Peter's arms in the jail, and he's able to just walk right out the door, and he's set free. And ultimately, the end of chapter 12 tells us how he dies because he decides to receive the praise and the worship as God from the people of Tyre and Sidon. And so then, the end of Acts, we see another Herod, and it's Herod Agrippa II, the son of Herod Agrippa I, and he's the one who Paul goes in front of in his trial after he's arrested for preaching about Jesus. So if you've ever been like me and been confused about all the Herods in the Bible, it's because there's a whole bunch of them, okay? We're talking about Herod the Great, and all the rest have that name Herod because he was so great. They're all from his family line. So with all that figured out, let me tell you about the guy in our story today. He was a kind of Jew, kind of sort of Jewish, but he was an Idumean. So he was from the very southern area of Israel, or what was Israel, now part of the Roman Empire, from the land of the Edomites. And if you know your Old Testament history, the Edomites were the family line of Esau. So when you go way back to Genesis, you have Abraham, and he has a son Isaac, and Isaac has two sons, Esau and Jacob. And Esau was the oldest, and he was supposed to inherit the father's blessing, but he sold the father's blessing for a bowl of stew, and then he was tricked out of the father's final prayer and inheritance by his brother Jacob. And so the Edomites are Esau's family, but the promise goes through Jacob, who God renamed Israel. Okay, so you have the Israelites and the Edomites, Jacob and Esau. And you'd think, well, they're kind of family, they're kin, they should get along. They don't. King Saul and King David both go to war with the Edomites to kind of put them in their place. So that's the backstory of King Herod's family line. So, yeah, he's kind of Jewish, but not really. And so he earned his position to be the king of Judea through Caesar because of his military conquests throughout this region. And he beat different tribes and he brought peace to this whole region of Judea. And so Caesar installed him to be the king of Judea. Then during his rule, he built several palaces and he built several military outposts. He rebuilt the city of Samaria. He built the port at Caesarea, which we read about in Acts several times. Most importantly, he renovated the temple in Jerusalem. Like, he was trying to do all these things so that the Israelites would actually accept him as their rightful king. What he's remembered for most, though, is being so suspicious of anybody who wants to try to take over his rule and his reign. In fact, we have the story from a Jewish historian that at one point his eldest son convinced him that two of his half-brothers, two other sons, were about to rebel against him and try to kill him to take over the throne. So he had those two boys murdered. And then even the son who warned him about this ultimately became a little suspicious to Dad, and Dad, Herod, thought, you're going to try to take over the throne for me as well. And he had him killed as well. So he had 3 of his children killed because he was suspicious that they were going to try to take over his role as king. So clearly, Herod struggles with feeling like anybody actually wants him to be king, his own family or the rest of the Israelites. So with all of this as the backstory, now we're going to read the story of Herod and the wise men from the Bible. It's a long passage. If you want to join along, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 2, reading from verses 1 through 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born, King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." That's why Jesus came, or why the angels came to the shepherds, like we talked about last week. Then Herod called the magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. So first you see the important role Caesar Augustus played. It was his edict that caused Jesus to be born in Bethlehem and ultimately fulfill the prophecy about where the Messiah was to be born. This wasn't like Joseph, the dad, was reading through Scripture and going, "Oh, I had a dream," or "the angel showed up to me and I'm going to have the Messiah. Mary, we got to get to Bethlehem to fulfill this prophecy." No, making sure that all the promises of God were fulfilled was not Joseph and Mary's job. That was God's job. And God used the edict of the man who is most powerful in all the land to be the one who moved Mary and Joseph from the town that they had a home and had prepared with a nursery and all those things, and instead moved them 90 miles south to where the Messiah had to be born. And if you noticed as we're reading through this passage, we were introduced to a fourth king in this story, the king that we were singing about all morning long, the rightful king of the Jews, Jesus Christ, the child who is born on Christmas Day. And you see, in this story, the Magi came looking for a king, but they weren't looking for Herod. The king of the Jews, he was by Caesar's appointment. Instead, they were looking for the rightful king of the Jews, the one sent by God to fulfill the prophecies and redeem his people. And this concept of the king of the Jews is actually a big deal. It goes all the way back to the Old Testament and the very first king of Israel. You see, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, what we read is that the people, the Israelites, they didn't like being governed by judges. They wanted to have a king like all the other nations around them. And so God told Samuel, who was their prophet at the time, Samuel, I need you to go and select Saul to be the king of the people. But don't worry about it. They haven't rejected you. They've rejected me. God wanted to be their king. He wanted the Israelites to be a different kind of nation that didn't have a earthly king set up like all the other nations. He wanted to rule and reign over that nation. But the people rejected God's leadership, and they wanted an earthly king. And while David was a great king, when you read through the Old Testament, there was a whole line of earthly kings who were not exactly great to the people. And so having somebody like Herod in the line of the Edomites, not even a full Israelite, as the king of the Jews, was simply outlandish. Now, having God come to this earth, fully human, to take over the throne of Israel, seems to be the most appropriate king of the Jews, as God is essentially taking back the kingship which he desired to hold on to from the very beginning of their nationhood. And let's step back and think about, who would you rather have be your king? Would you rather have it be Herod or Jesus, the Christ child? We look at Herod's life and we see he was focused on building up his earthly kingdom. More buildings, more ports, more things that would make him be remembered as Herod the Great. Jesus instead was focused on building a spiritual kingdom, a heavenly kingdom, ultimately for the glory not of himself, but the glory of God his Father. Herod held an iron-tight grip on his authority and his position. He didn't want anybody taking it away from him. Yet we see Jesus at the end of his ministry giving all authority to us and saying, go and have authority and dominion over the evil spirits. Spread my kingdom. Be light like me. Be my representatives to all the earth. He releases his authority to us. He doesn't hold on to it tightly. Where Herod is suspicious of rebellion, and when he thinks somebody is against him, he has them killed, even his own sons. When God saw rebellion on this earth, he sent his own son to the earth to be king for us and to die in place of us. He doesn't kill us for our rebellion. He sends a substitute, his own son, to die in our place. And so that's the difference between an earthly king, Herod, and what was common in those days, and a heavenly king, Jesus, who God sent to rule over all his people. And when we read this story, we see that both the Magi and Herod, they believed that this child who came was actually the Messiah, the promised one from the Scriptures. But boy, oh boy, didn't they have two completely different responses. When the Magi see the star and they believe that a new king has been born in Israel, they hop on their camels, they throw gifts on the saddles, and they take off, heading west, ready to celebrate. When they find the new king, it says that they are overjoyed. And when they arrive, they bow down, they give him these gifts, and they worship. Yes, the Magi are men of significance and authority, but they also recognize that this young child sits in a realm of authority far above themselves. Compared to them, they are merely kings of their own castle, and yet they are still overjoyed at his presence. But Herod's response couldn't be more different. When he hears about the birth of this promised child, he immediately feels threatened. Where the Magi are overjoyed, we're told that Herod is greatly disturbed. While the Magi can return home to where they have authority and power, Herod recognizes there is no room for two kings of the Jews. And so rather than rejoicing in God's fulfillment of this promise, he seeks out how he can eliminate the competition, just like he's already done with his own sons. As the story continues, he has all the babies 2 years old and younger murdered because he wants to make sure nobody ever takes his place of authority. His focus has nothing to do whatsoever with what God is doing, and instead has everything to do with how he can keep his grip on power and authority for himself. He's attacking. So those are the many kings of the Christmas story. And they show us two polar opposite responses to this new king, this Christ child. One chooses to bow and to worship, and the other chooses to attack. And we have this exact same decision in our lives today. We have to decide, are we willing to bow down and worship King Jesus like the Magi, the true king of this world? Or are we going to fight like Herod to remain the king of our own castle, where we are the most important, where we are calling the shots, where we get to decide, what do I do? How do I spend my time? How do I spend my money? Do I go to church on Sunday or not? I'll make that decision for myself. But if we're going to be like the Magi and submit our allegiance to the true King Jesus, then we have to recognize every single decision in our lives has to line up with what he desires for us. As a citizen of the kingdom, we don't get to make every single decision exactly how we want. As citizens of the kingdom, we have to live according to the rules of the kingdom. We have to live in obedience. We have to follow his righteousness. Instead, we see these people all over our world around us, and they're following these fraud kings often in our culture. A lot of people have set themselves up and said, you know what? Follow me and you'll be happy. Instagram influencers, if you buy clothes like me, then you can be happy. Politicians, if you vote like for me and you follow my policies, then we can be happy. Athletes, follow my team, we're going to win, and then you'll be overjoyed. We set up all sorts of people as these fraud kings, just like Herod in our lives. I'll make you the person that I'm following. You're the most important person in my life. And somehow, if I hitch my cart to you, I'll be happy. But we understand that's not how this world works. There's only one king worth bowing down and giving our allegiance to. There's only one king who truly has your best interests in his mind. And that is Jesus Christ, the God who came from heaven to earth as an infant to live a perfect life, to teach all these new ways of thinking, of love and mercy and grace, who ultimately sacrificed himself and was willing to die on a cross for us so that we could be made right with God, so that we could be rescued out of this broken, messy world and ultimately live in the perfect new heaven and new earth. That's what King Jesus has done. And we have a decision to make. Are we going to follow him, or are we going to try to keep doing this on our own? Following Jesus includes a recognition that we are not our own kings. We can't serve two different masters. We can't on Sundays come here and say, Jesus, I worship you, but the other 6 days of the week do whatever the heck we please. That's not how it works. It means submitting our lives and our choices completely to the ways of our King. And if you've never made that decision, I encourage you today to choose to follow Jesus, to recognize that you have a choice in front of you. And do you believe that Jesus truly is the authority over all the earth, that he truly is the King who has your best interests in his heart? And if you believe that and you want to follow him and you want to be a part of his kingdom, I encourage you, talk to me after the service today on your way out. Let me know that you want to make that decision. Because making Jesus the King of your life is truly the best decision you can make. Trusting that he is good and that he wants what's best for you is going to change how you think about all the events of your life. Rather than seeing things as coincidence or just bad luck, you're going to recognize that there's a God who maybe in the junk is still going to work in your favor, to grow you and to teach you, to allow you to help others, even in the mess. How you look at the entire world changes when you give your allegiance to Jesus. Lots of Herods are trying to seek out your allegiance, but there is only one rightful king that we should ever bow our hearts and our minds to, and that is the baby born in the manger.